Last time we came across some skepticism about the global warming narrative. In this episode, I want to look at some talks on this same subject given by scholars with a range of thoughts about it. First, let's listen to Aaron Brown, a statistician who accepts the global warming story, but who realizes that the ambiguous and confusing language used by the IPCC can be very misleading.
I read the report that the people claiming a 2030 deadline are relying upon, and they have misread it.
Aaron Brown is a mathematician and statistician who was taught at NYU and UCSD. Where did the claim that we have until 2030 come from? Among the first to popularize it was teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg, who in speaking before the UN chastised world leaders for their inaction. Thunberg took the 2030 deadline from a 2018 special report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. But after the IPCC report was released, prominent climate scientists, including some of the report's authors, publicly raised doubts about the 2030 deadline. The panel did not say that we have 12 years left to save the world, IPCC Working Group co-chair James Skia told the Associated Press. "Please stop saying something globally bad is going to happen in 2030, wrote fellow leading report author Miles Allen. The IPCC does not draw a planetary boundary at 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which lie climate dragons. All the time-limited frames are bullshit," NASA's Gavin Schmidt told Axios.
Properly read, the report is actually an argument for predictable, sustainable solutions over several decades using experimentation and innovation, not a rush toward risky short-term solutions that focus entirely on warming to the detriment of general environmental stewardship.
By calculating the current rate of global warming and plotting it out along a graph, we see that the answer to the question they pose is the year 2052. But remember that they gave a 22-year range, starting in 2030 and ending in 2052. How did they get there? The 2030 date that activists have trumpeted appears in this chart in the report. In the worst-case scenario, or the top of the shaded area, we see that warming hits 1.5 degrees by the year 2030. In the best-case scenario, or the bottom of the shaded area, we see that warming actually never hits 1.5 degrees. But what most commentators haven't paid attention to is that this is not a measure of actual warming. This chart is actually showing estimates of anthropogenic warming, or warming that the authors hypothesize is caused by humans. The gray line shows the actual changes in the planet's surface temperatures, and the orange shaded area represents the author's estimates of what humans are contributing to the overall warming trend. So the worst case scenario that gets us to 1.5 degrees by 2030 does not represent actual temperature increases, but the upper limit of how much the authors think humans could possibly be contributing if our activities were happening in isolation.
People making the sky is falling claims probably haven't read the report and think that it's saying actual temperatures will increase by 1.5 degrees in 2030. The range of dates the report discusses are actually about human contribution to global warming. If you think the problem of global warming is higher temperatures, melting ice caps, rising sea levels, then you care about the date the report projects actual temperatures will reach 1.5 degrees, which is 2052 if things continue at the current rate. It's a very dangerous game if you want strong, sensible long-term solutions to climate change to scare people into them by making wild short-term predictions. People who really believe 2030 is a disaster year have to focus on geoengineering, scattering beads to reflect sunlight, injecting aerosols in the stratosphere. Rushing these things through without proper testing has entirely unpredictable consequences and could backfire to much worse environmental damage than the problem they're intended to solve.
One might ask, could it be that the confusion pointed out here was deliberate? And how did it come about that the comments by lead authors, pointing out that the report did not say there were only 12 years to disaster, and that there were no climate dragons after 2030, and that the idea of time-limited frames are nonsense, were not widely publicized? The next clip is by Professor William Happer. He's been a professor at Princeton University for many years. He's been a consultant on atmospheric physics with the US Department of Defense on top-secret projects, and is one of the world's most respected experts on the physics of the atmosphere.
Now, here is the most important view graph of today. And so I'm going to take some time to talk about this view graph. At the very top is Max Planck. In the year 1900, Max Planck published a formula for the blue smooth curve you see on the view graph. Now, what this view graph shows is it's the thermal radiation coming out to space through clear air, no clouds, versus frequency. So the frequency goes left to right, the number of waves per centimeter, and going up is milliwatts per square meter. So that blue curve was actually known empirically. Lots of experimentalists had measured it in the late 1800s, but nobody could figure out what it was. And so the solution of this problem by Max Planck was really the invention of quantum mechanics. If you look down at the Earth, you don't see this blue curve from a satellite. What you see is very close to this jagged black curve here. And I like to call that the Schwarzschild curve. Schwarzschild was another great German physicist. He did amazing things. He was the first, for example, to solve Einstein's general theory of relativity, give an analytic solution to that. People still use it today. And he also showed how to account for the effects of greenhouse gases that we're talking about, carbon dioxide, water vapor, which is by far the most important greenhouse gas, methane. The area under the black curve is the amount of radiation that actually gets out to space and cools the Earth. The more that area, the more the Earth cools. And it's only about 70% of the area under the blue curve. Greenhouse gases are definitely slowing the cooling of the Earth. There really is a greenhouse effect. It's quite substantial. Most of it's water, but a non-trivial amount is CO2. But the important point that I don't want you to forget today is if you double CO2, what happens is you go from this jagged black curve to a jagged red curve, which is almost coincident. You can only see the difference between the red curve and the jagged black curve right in the bottom of the CO2 absorption emission band. And if you would actually put in the numbers here, you find that if you double CO2, 100% increase of CO2, you decrease radiation to space by 1%. So let that sink in. Huge effect, huge doubling effect of doubling CO2, at least in the numbers of CO2 atoms. We're far from doubling it today. It'll take a long time. It only causes a 1% change. CO2 is a very poor greenhouse gas. It's not an efficient greenhouse gas. If you take all the CO2 away, focus on this view graph again, you go to the green curve. So going from no CO2 at all gives you the green curve and the black curve. They coincide, except in the CO2 band. There's a huge effect of going from 0 CO2 to 400 parts per million, for which this calculation was done. But going to 800 parts per million, it almost doesn't matter. So you get all of the effect in the first little bit of added CO2. Now, you could ask, how do you know that you know how to calculate correctly? And well, this is sort of my professional field, so I know how to do this, but this is a comparison of what we calculate compared to what's observed. So on the right, you see some measured spectra of thermal radiation coming up to satellites. They've got interferometers there that do these measurements. They're beautifully calibrated. And on the left, you can see our model calculations. You really can't tell the difference. So there are not many parts of the climate narrative that you can actually do a calculation that is 1 or 2%. If this is one of them, you really can't make a mistake here. So it's really true that doubling CO2 only causes a 1% decrease of radiation. IPCC gets the same answer, so this is not really controversial, although they will never show you the curve or tell you that it's 1%. You know, that would interfere with the narrative. Okay, so this is radiation to space. So how do you change that into a temperature? Nobody cares about radiation to space. They're worried that we'll get intolerable warming of the surface of the Earth where we live or other parts of the atmosphere. The warming comes from this first formula. The T to the fourth, the Stefan-Boltzmann formula. It says that the flux goes as the fourth power of the absolute temperature. Stefan, he actually found this formula empirically. Until he did just splendid experiments, there were all sorts of crazy assumptions about how thermal radiation depended on temperature, and all were very complicated. And he found that actually the dependence goes as this extremely simple T to the fourth, absolute T to the fourth. So that was his first great discovery. But he made another discovery which was equally great, and he discovered this graduate student who's on the lower right, and that's Ludwig Boltzmann. When Ludwig showed up to Professor Stefan said, well, I've discovered this interesting formula. It says that thermal radiation goes at the fourth power of the temperature, and can you figure out why? Boltzmann studied it for a few months, and he came in and he said, I've solved it. It depends on simply the properties of radiation and on thermodynamics. So it's a combination of thermodynamics and the theory of electromagnetic radiation, a very simple proof that you can write down in 4 or 5 lines. If you do a little simple calculus and say, I want to keep that flux the same because that flux is provided by the sun. So if the sun continues to heat the Earth at the same rate, but you decrease the radiation to space, that will mean the Earth will start to warm up. You know, we're getting more energy in than we're shedding to space. And so this means that the temperature only has to increase by 1/4%. 1/4% increase of temperature will compensate for a 1% decrease in radiation to space. So you can do the first order climate science in your head, and it says that the warming from doubling CO2 is 1/4% of the absolute temperature, which is around 300. The warming is 0.7 centigrade, very small. Now, 0.7 centigrade, you know, you really can't feel that. You know, air conditioners won't trip on and off if the temperature goes up 0.7. So it's really a problem if you're in the climate science community. What do you do about this? You know, if it's only this much, then there is no climate emergency, no matter what people do. It's just not enough to matter. And so what IPCC has done is they've assumed enormous positive feedbacks. So the small direct warming from CO2 is supposed to be amplified by factors of 4, 5, 6, you know, because CO2 is such a puny greenhouse gas. It's not a very potent greenhouse gas. It's not very good at warming, but if you assume lots of feedback, you can keep the money coming in. The problem with that, most natural feedbacks are negative. They're not positive. This is even dignified by the name of a principle. It's Le Chatelier's principle. Le Chatelier was a French chemist who first enunciated this. When a simple system in thermodynamic equilibrium is subjected to a change in concentration, temperature, volume, or pressure, we've got a change in CO2 concentration. Number one, the system changes to a new equilibrium. And number two, the change partly counteracts the applied change. So this says that the 0.7 degree of warming from doubling is probably an overestimate because there are probably negative feedbacks. This is my last slide, and I'll be glad to take questions afterward. This is what's going to happen to countries that really go to net zero. It will be a disaster. I don't have time to go into all the reasons, but the reason I'm doing this, and I hope some of you will do the same thing, is summarized by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the poor guy who was hanged by the Nazis. If I see a madman driving a car into a group of innocent bystanders, then I can't simply wait for the catastrophe and then comfort the wounded and bury the dead. I must try to wrestle the steering wheel out of the hands of the driver.
I find it very interesting that he says the IPCC are fully aware of the Planck-Schwarzschild radiation and the Stefan-Boltzmann heating calculations, but never mention them, and continue to claim that new CO2 added to the atmosphere has an enormous heating effect. Stephen F. Hayward is a resident scholar at Berkeley. He's taught at several universities, including the University of Colorado at Boulder and Pepperdine. In a lecture at Hillsdale College, he gave an address which is available on YouTube under the title, "A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Global Warming."
Speech this evening is "A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Global Warming." 3 funny things have happened on the way to global warming. 3 of them. First, the warming stopped. Imagine that. Second, the policy agenda of the climatistas, as I call them, or an even better term for the climate crusaders, is Thermageddonites. I didn't think of that. That's Britain's Lord Monckton came up with that, and I think that one's really good. But the policy agenda of the climatistas has been revealed to be completely absurd. And I'll walk you through that here in a moment. But there's a corollary to that. As a thought experiment, even if catastrophic human-caused climate change turned out to be true, environmentalists are the last people we would want to put in charge of dealing with the problem. Full stop. The third funny thing that has happened is something that no one predicted. There's been some talk about it today at lunch and other presentations, and that's the revival of the oil and gas energy sector through the technological revolution of directional drilling and rock massaging. That's what I call fracking, rock massaging. And if our political class in Washington and the media had known this was going on, they surely would have done something to stop it. And that's what they're trying to do now, of course, but there's too late. It's too much momentum. Aren't markets and innovation wonderful? So let's take these in order. First, about the warming stopping. Between roughly 1978 and 1998, a 20-year period, the catastrophic global warming scenario seemed to have some evidence on its side. During that roughly 2-decade period, the global average temperature rose suddenly and sharply by about 0.4 of a degree Celsius. And conveniently, that was right in line with what a lot of the newfangled computer climate models predicted. But then, as we say, the funny thing happened. It suddenly stopped, even though greenhouse gases kept rising in the atmosphere at a steady rate. It is becoming the biggest embarrassment for the scientific consensus since Piltdown Man. You know, somebody today asked Ken Green about, or made reference to the email scandals of the East Anglia Climate Unit in 2009. There's one of those emails from climatologist Kevin Trenberth. He's one of the deep dish climate alarmists at Boulder. And he said in one of those emails, and I'll quote him here, he said it was a travesty that climate scientists could not explain the pause. They've been scrambling ever since to offer a whole series of explanations. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's IPCC, as Ken mentioned today, they're doing their best to paper this all over and twist and shout and do everything they can to try and cover up the fact that their scheme is failing. And they admit these things very grudgingly and talk about how certain areas of essential knowledge of how the climate system works continue to really elude our grasp. In particular, clouds and water vapor. That's really important to the story. So let me quote one quotable part, which goes like this. This is a quote now, there remain significant errors on the model simulation of clouds. Next sentence. It is very likely that these errors contribute significantly to the uncertainties in estimates of cloud feedbacks and consequently in the climate change projections. And if you really read it carefully in 10 times, you realize that they admit that it's possible that clouds could cancel out most of the forcing effect of greenhouse gases. This is what people like Richard Lindzen have been saying for a long time. Other explanations for the pause include unusual western Pacific wind patterns, I'm not making this up, aerosols, which means higher level particulates in the atmosphere, and my favorite, increased solar variation. There's this thing up in the sky called the sun. You may have seen it. And what's strange is that not an awful lot of people, I mean, not just ordinary citizens who wonder about this, but scientists even, would say, what about variations in solar radiation and sunspots? And the climate science community always says no. And their official models, if you read them, say it's a very tiny factor in any variation in the climate. And so for them now to say solar variation is driving the pause, that's interesting, isn't it? The opinion polls show that the public has a case of what I call apocalypse fatigue. And so they've rankly politicized this issue and demonized any self-criticism, even within its ranks. This is one lady, Judith Curry at Georgia Tech, who's always been in the conventional climate science community. Till 5 or 6 years ago, she started saying, I think maybe we have some things wrong here, and we should rethink some things. And by the way, we ought to talk to some of the climate skeptics instead of screaming at them. Well, guess what's happened to her? She's been cast into outer darkness by the science. And she was the chairman of the geophysics department at Georgia Tech, person of considerable scientific chops. That's what happens if you raise a dissent or a doubt.
He mentions some interesting people. Richard Lindzen, who we met in the last episode, Lord Monckton, who we'll meet later, and Judith Curry, who had the guts to question the global catastrophe story even while knowing she would be demonized and exiled from the establishment.
I'm Scott Turner. I'm Director of Science Programs here at the National Association of Scholars, and I'm the regular host for this webinar series. Today's webinar is around the topic Rethinking Climate Risk, and it's a special webinar for a couple of reasons. The first reason is our guest, Judith Curry, who is Emerita Professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences program at Georgia Tech University. I describe Judith Curry as a climate realist. She's emerged as one of several public faces representing climate realism, which is to say that before we are all stampeded into a climate panic, that we pause, take a breath, and think realistically about the issue. She's recently published a very fine book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response. This is from Anthem Press, and it's available on Amazon.
My journey in this rather unusual direction started in 2010 when I became concerned about the behavior of climate scientists, particularly IPCC authors. It was becoming so political. They were trying to sabotage their opponents, evade Freedom of Information Act requests. And I became very concerned by all this. And I called them out on it publicly, saying that we need to make all of our data and methods publicly available, complete transparency. We need to be more honest about uncertainty. And we have to be respectful to other scientists who are critical of our research, and we have to engage them in constructive dialogue and debate as we try to move our understanding forward. Now, all that may sound like motherhood and apple pie, but there was a huge backlash against me by the climatariat, the important scientists and the IPCC or whatever. Who am I to criticize all these important people? And on it goes. So the more pushback I got from the climate science establishment, if you will, I became very popular with people from other different fields, from the policy sciences and the social sciences and engineers and oceanographers and communication specialists and philosophers of sciences who thought my arguments were interesting and important. When I started my blog shortly after that, the idea of my blog was to, look at all these hidden assumptions and all the uncertainties that the climate establishment was trying to sweep under the rug. Let's get all these things out into the open, the value judgments, all of these things that nobody's talking about, but are, basic to the simplistic narrative that the UN has put forth. And so, I increasingly drew the ire of the climate establishment as I was doing this. And, academia became increasingly uncomfortable. I seeded my blog with a series on climate science and the uncertainty monster, which represented a major theme of my work following 2010, both academic and in the public communications world. When, academia just became very uncomfortable. I was being marginalized, and it was impossible for me to find another academic position. If you Google Judith Curry at the time, you would see Judith Curry, serial climate misinformer, Judith Curry, climate denier, and that was my the whole profile on page 1 of my Google search for Judith Curry. I was, unhireable in academia at that point. So I said, okay. So I headed for the private sector. I had started a company a few years before, and then I just went full-time in my company. Funding is such a canard. The government funding really torques the research in many ways. In climate science, all the announcements of opportunity implicitly or explicitly, assume dangerous human-caused warming and ask for proposals, related to that. It's very hard to get anything else funded. So there's agendas all over the place. But the amount of money spent by billionaire environmental activists is huge. I mean, it dwarfs anything from the oil companies in terms of what they're spending on this issue. So, I mean, money influences everywhere. But so you just listen to the arguments. Don't try to tar somebody, with their funding sources. Just listen to their arguments. And nobody seems willing to do that. It's so tribal, and they throw you into one tribe or another, and then they dismiss you or follow you, depending on which tribe you align with. So it's just become completely divorced of reason, logic, and genuine argumentation. Natural variability dominates our weather and climate extremes. And even if we were, successful at eliminating fossil fuels, say by 2040 or 2050 or whatever, even if you believe the climate models, we probably wouldn't notice any different in the weather until the 22nd century. Mandates from the UN, emissions targets and deadlines, and on it goes. They're meaningless, and they're not science-driven. They're politically driven to amplify the emergency as much as they politically think is feasible. They're not science-driven targets. At the same time, we shouldn't trash the environment unnecessarily, and sort of old-fashioned environmentalism that worries about water and air pollution and species. Can we go back to that, please? Rather than, that's all been completely dismissed in favor of the climate change agenda with adverse impacts on the environment.
Unfortunately, we haven't enough time to look at the work of many other eminent scientists that I'd like to share with you. But there's just time to look at Christopher Monckton, speaking to a meeting at Oxford University.
Let me first of all say there is support for the catastrophist position in the peer-reviewed literature. Here is a paper from Environmental Research Letters in 2013 by researchers from the University of Queensland. And they said that they had reviewed, bless their little cotton socks, 11,944 papers on climate science and related topics, and that they said that 97.1% of those papers had explicitly, in terms, endorsed the proposition that global warming is chiefly anthropogenic. So in those days they used the word man-made. And that was their statement of the consensus proposition. There in red, global warming is chiefly anthropogenic. But it doesn't say a word about tipping points or ice disappearing or things being dangerous. The only thing the consensus proposition actually says, according to this paper, which is the largest sample of its kind ever conducted, is that global warming is chiefly anthropogenic. But let us look a little bit further into this paper, which received enormous publicity. For instance, Mr. Obama, on his Twitter feed, when that paper of 2013 came out, said 97% of scientists agree global warming is real, man-made, and dangerous. But you've just seen the definition of the consensus position on the previous slide. Not a word about danger in it. And this is the bait and switch by which the political forces behind this, which I will talk a little bit more about later, have managed to convince a lot of people who frankly ought to know better that global warming is a threat, when in fact it's very likely to prove to be a net benefit. Now let us look at this paper a little bit in more detail. Here is a paper published later that year in the Journal of Science and Education, after peer review, by Legates et al. And I must confess that I was not only one of the authors of this paper, but I also did the counting and reading of the 11,944 papers to find out what had really happened. And I discovered that the authors of the original paper from Australia had themselves listed only 65 papers, or 0.5% of the original 11,944, as having explicitly endorsed the consensus position. Well, we then read all 64 of those papers, or 65, and we found that only 41, or 0.3%, not 97.1%, 0.3%, had actually endorsed even that milquetoast consensus proposition that global warming of recent decades was mostly man-made. Now, how many of you have seen this paper and its result reported in any mainstream news medium anywhere? I see no hands. Now, given the intensity of the debate about global warming, is it not interesting that the paper saying that 97.1% of scientists had said they supported the consensus position was widely reported, and it was mentioned by ministers in the British Parliament and in many other parliaments. It was mentioned by Mr. Obama in his Twitter feed. Nobody mentioned this result, because we went and did what scientists, sir, are supposed to do. We did not simply believe the propaganda. We went and checked meticulously and boringly. I had to write a computer program to read down their list of the papers because it was in comma delimited format, which is extremely irritating. And once I'd done that, and I got this result, 64 or 65 papers, I thought I'd programmed it wrong. So then I had to do it again, this time using the search function in the form of Microsoft Word that deals with text files, which is called Notepad. And I had to go through by hand and check it by hand, and it came out the same. Now, anybody could have done that, but it was only we who did it. And when we had done it and reported it, nobody in the mainstream news media wanted to know. And that should concern us all, because what it means is that freedom of speech is being shut down, and you cannot have a proper academic discussion on matters like this if a result as appallingly, deliberately bad as that can be publicised everywhere, and the correction to it that you see on the screen now doesn't get any coverage at all. Now, a citizen of Queensland was deeply upset when he saw Legates et al. And realised what Cook et al. Had done. So he went to Queensland Police and he swore out a complaint saying that the perpetrators of the original paper had, in issuing that paper, also perpetrated a fraud. They had made money for themselves as researchers by pretending to do research showing this 97.1% consensus when their own data file, which I made them produce, it took me 3 weeks to get it from them, showed that actually they had themselves counted only 0.3%. And the Queensland Police investigated, and they reported back to that citizen that a deception had occurred. But the social scientist concerned, who'd written this paper, had by then left Australia, and so there was nothing they could do. They also said they would have found it difficult to quantify the sheer magnitude of the damage done to people's pockets by the belief engendered by this paper that there really was a scientific consensus which does not in fact exist. How many of you have seen in any mainstream news medium any report of Queensland Police's finding about Cook et al. 2013? I see no hands.
Lord Monckton mentioned some reasons for the dishonesty exposed by Legates et al. I suggest that you watch the whole video, Lord Monckton, Net Zero Emissions, the costliest error in physics and of economics in history. I think one thing is becoming rather obvious. There's an awful lot of deceit and even deliberate lies in this whole field. It would be well to consider that a false witness shall not go unpunished, and he that speaketh lies shall not escape. Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find a link on my channel banner and in the description below.